Between 1957 and 1964, patients checked into the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal for depression, anxiety, and grief. They signed consent forms for psychiatric treatment. Inside, they were placed into drug-induced comas lasting weeks, given electroshock at 30 to 40 times the standard clinical intensity, and had audio recordings played on a loop directly into their ears while unconscious. The CIA was funding every session. Most of his patients never recovered what was taken. This is MKUltra Subproject 68. Ewan Cameron was born in Scotland in 1901, and by the 1950s held credentials that almost no psychiatrist in the world could match. He had served as president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association, the only person ever to lead all three. He ran the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University and directed the Allen Memorial Institute, a Victorian mansion on the slope of Mount Royal that had been converted into one of Canada's most respected psychiatric facilities. When he entered a room of clinicians, the room deferred to him. He had spent his career developing a specific theory. The human personality, Cameron believed, was not fixed. Patterns of thought, the sick patterns that produced depression, anxiety, and breakdown, were learned. What could be learned could be unlearned. He called the overall approach psychic driving. The first phase was depatterning, stripping the patient's existing patterns down to nothing. The second phase was reconstruction, driving new, healthier patterns in through repeated suggestion. Since 1953, the agency had been running MKUltra, a classified program of behavioral research aimed at developing interrogation techniques, compliance methods, and ways to render a subject amnesiac or psychologically controllable on demand. They had been searching for what Cameron appeared to already be building, a method of systematically dismantling an existing personality. They funded his work through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, routing the money in a way that kept the agency's involvement off any document a patient might see. Cameron knew where the funding came from. His patients did not. The people who came to the Allen Memorial Institute were not severely ill. One was a woman who had come in following a miscarriage referred by her family doctor for depression. Another had been treated for anxiety. Several had sought help for what would today be described as manageable psychiatric conditions. They had signed consent forms for treatment. The forms did not describe what treatment would involve. They did not mention the CIA. They did not mention what Cameron was actually trying to do. None of them knew they were research subjects. The depatterning sequence had three components, applied in stages. The first was drug-induced sleep. Patients were placed under using combinations of barbiturates and other sedatives and kept unconscious for weeks at a time. Some patients were held in this state for 30 days, some for longer. The ward where this happened was kept dark and quiet. Nurses checked patients on a schedule. Family members were not always permitted to visit. During periods of semi-consciousness, Cameron administered the second component, electroconvulsive therapy. Standard clinical ECT at the time involved a single carefully calibrated session, used selectively and with precise dosing. Cameron used it at 30 to 40 times that intensity, multiple times per day in some cases. The goal was not to treat the patient, the goal was to disrupt the neural structures that held the existing personality in place. The third component was the audio recordings. Cameron recorded his patients during therapy sessions, their own voices describing their fears, their failures, their self-perception. He then played those recordings back to them on continuous loops through small speakers positioned next to their heads while they were unconscious or barely conscious. 16 hours a day in some documented cases, for weeks. The theory was that the recorded words would penetrate below the disrupted surface and begin reshaping the patterns at a deeper level. What emerged from those words was not reshaped. Patients who had come in for depression woke from weeks of drug-induced unconsciousness not knowing where they were. Some did not recognize their husbands or wives standing at the bedside. Some could not control basic bodily functions. Some had regressed so completely that staff described their behavior as childlike, unable to hold a sustained conversation, asking the same questions every few minutes without retaining the answers. One patient, following months of depatterning, could not account for his own profession. He could not explain how old he was. He had been a practicing physician before he came in. The reconstruction phase, the psychic driving that was supposed to follow the erasure, was inconsistently applied and produced no documented successful outcomes. The first phase had worked, the second phase had not worked once. Cameron continued the program until 1964. He published papers throughout this period describing the theory and its promise. He presented at international conferences. The psychiatric establishment received his work as the output of a serious researcher pursuing a legitimate clinical question. No formal body reviewed what was happening to the patients inside the Allen Memorial Institute. No regulatory structure existed that would have required them to. He died on September 8, 1967, of a heart attack while hiking in the Adirondack Mountains. He was 65 years old. He had never been investigated. He had never been asked to account for a single patient. The people he had depatterned were still alive. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. Congressional pressure was mounting following Watergate, and Helms did not want the program's documentation to surface in any investigation. The order reached the agency's operational files. Thousands of documents were destroyed. The program effectively ceased to exist on paper. The order did not reach a set of files that had been routed to a separate CIA records building and cataloged under financial rather than operational headings. When a researcher filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 1977, those documents came back: budget lines, payment receipts, project proposals, correspondence between Cameron and agency contacts. Enough to reconstruct what had happened at the Allen Memorial Institute and at other MKUltra sites across the United States. The Senate held hearings the same year. The testimony described a program conducted on subjects who had not consented to it, funded by an agency with no medical authority, run by a psychiatrist who had been dead for a decade and couldn't be questioned. One of the survivors who eventually filed suit against the CIA was the woman who had come in after her miscarriage. She was the wife of a Canadian member of parliament. She had spent years inside the institute and decades afterward unable to fully explain to people around her what had been done to the inside of her mind. The CIA settled with a group of Canadian survivors in the late 1980s. Several $100,000 distributed among 9 plaintiffs, paid without any admission of wrongdoing. The Canadian government reached its own settlement with a larger group of survivors years later. No criminal charges were filed in either country. The total CIA expenditure on Cameron's program across 7 years was approximately $60,000. The settlements paid out to survivors exceeded that figure,